Europe. Europe everywhere speaks of European continental unity. Even though Europe has fought more fratricidal wars than any other continent or all the continents put together, Europe still speaks of European continental unity. Of course, Africa will unify before Europe, but that's not the point of discussion here this evening. The fact that Europe, with all the fratricidal wars she had fought, can speak of continental unity shows this evolutionary process. Africa, like any other society, anywhere in the world, was involved in this same evolutionary process, going from family to tribe, to clan, to nation, to continent. This evolutionary process was interrupted by European imperialism. It came in two forms, slavery and colonialism. First, they took over 300 million, the strongest, out of Africa, and then they divided Africa at the Berlin Conference. So you can see that Africa herself was moving on this evolutionary process. This evolutionary process, which would lead to continental unity, and Africa will still be the first continent unified, was interrupted by European capitalism. Since it was interrupted by European capitalism and evolutionary process, the only way that Africa can unite today is through a revolutionary process aiming at a socialist economy. If capitalism destroyed us, it doesn't make sense to use capitalism to continue with it. We must use the antithesis of capitalism, which of course is socialism. And certainly if an evolutionary process has been interrupted, the only way we can capture the time lost is through a revolutionary process. We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people. So this then is the general outlines of Pan-Africanism. So you must not think that Africanism just began. Had Africa been left untrampled by European imperialism, we'd have a long time achieved continental unity. Secondly, Pan-Africanism must be seen as a movement, a mass movement. And this mass movement must be properly understood. Africa, of course, because of racism, is belittled everywhere. And many people do not see Africa's constant, underline the word constant, contributions to world civilization. Since the 1940s, Africa has given, even before the 1940s actually, we can go back to the Honorable Marcus Garvey, Africa has given to world political movements a mass character. Africans revolt in masses, never as a vanguard party. If you look at the independence struggle in Africa, it was nothing less than mass. If you look at the struggle in the Caribbean for independence, it was nothing less than mass. And even in the United States of America, the only movement they call a mass movement is our movement. Therefore, this mass character must be properly understood. Pan-Africanism has this mass character. Africans have this mass character in responding. And our responsibility is to bring this mass character together, make it precise so that it can direct its blows at the enemy, hitting him until we knock him down. Therefore, the task of Pan-Africanism is to gather the masses of our people together in the same organization, irrespective of where they find themselves, be it in Europe, be it in the United States, be it in the Caribbean, or be it in Africa. This is the first aspect, then we must understand. Pan-Africanism found its organizational expressions in 1900. Here, a Pan-African conference, here the word conference, was organized by Africans from all over the world. They came together deciding that something must be done for Africa. One of the leading organizers of this conference was a man by the name of Henry Sylvester Williams, born in Trinidad, a man whom you should do some history on, a very, very great man. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois attended the conference, but he was not one of the leaders in 1900. By 1917, 1918, the idea of a necessity for a Pan-African Congress, not conference, Congress, was to be called. But most of the people who did the conference were dead. Henry Sylvester Williams was dead. A lot of them were dead. Du Bois was about the only one who was alive. Du Bois recognized he had a historic responsibility to continue the work of Pan-Africanism, so he called the first Pan-African Congress. Make a clear distinction. The first one in 1900 was a conference. Du Bois, being intelligent, understanding that a conference is limited and a Congress has more elasticity and can go longer, called it a Pan-African Congress. From the 1990s up until 1945, we could say seriously, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois just about single-handedly kept the flame of Pan-Africanism alive. One thing must also be underlined to you. Pan-Africanism was brought into being in its organized form by the Africans outside of Africa. This was done only because of the oppression of Africa. At that time, Africa was under total colonial domination. There could be no political meetings. As a matter of fact, if you had the paper of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, you could go to jail. So the conditions were such that it was difficult for the Africans on the continent to organize. Africans off of the continent, recognizing this, came quickly to fill up that gap. So Pan-Africanism itself was brought to bear by the diaspora. But you must not think that the diaspora brought Pan-Africanism for the diaspora. Not at all. The center of the discussions has always been Africa. This must be properly understood. Some people try to shift it, take it somewhere else, but Africa has always been the focus. Du Bois carried on his congresses up until the 5th Congress in 1945. Because of time, we're just going through them quickly. In 1945, saw the 5th Pan-African Congress. Here, you had Africans born on the continent, in the Caribbean, and Africans, of course, born in Europe and the United States. At this 5th Pan-African Congress, there were 3 co-secretaries, of course, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore of Trinidad, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. So he had an African from the Caribbean, one from the United States, and one from the continent, who were co-secretaries of the 5th Pan-African Congress. The 5th Pan-African Congress is crucial for us. A decision was made there. They said that the final confrontation with colonialism is coming. After all, this is 1945, and you must know that there's negative and positives in everything. I remember once as a young man reading Mein Kampf on an airplane, sitting next to a woman. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean what I'm doing? I'm reading Mein Kampf." "Why are you reading it?" I said, "Well, Hitler's a very important man. He had historical effects on the world, you know." She said, "Well, I'm a Jew." I said, "Have you read it?" She said, "No." I said, "Oh, that's bad." I said, "Have you not read Sun Yat-sen?" She said, "No." I said, "He says the first law of war is to know the enemy. If I were a Jew, I would read everything there is to read on Hitler." Of course. Of course. So, while reading Hitler, she was arguing. I said, "Well, Hitler had some positive effect anyway." She said, "What positive effect did Hitler have?" I said, "Hitler weakened European imperialism. He weakened the British, he weakened the French, he weakened the Portuguese, he weakened the Belgians, and that's how we got independence." And these are facts of life. These are facts of life. When Hitler got through with Britain, when the Indians said they want independence, Britain could do anything but get out the way and let them have independence. As a matter of fact, they got Mahatma Gandhi quick because they didn't want to deal with the armed struggle that the Indians were preparing for British imperialism in India. And by the time India was free, well, it was over. China came up. After China, of course, Africa throughout, etc., etc. And by 1960, in 15 short years of the declaration of the 5th Pan-African Congress in 1945, 2/3 of the African continent was independent. You must understand clearly the importance of this. Now, at the 5th Pan-African Congress, they said the only solution to the final confrontation is mass organization. And I say, if you look at Africans, we have nothing but mass character in our struggles. Of course, this mass character for the moment is spontaneous and must be transformed to something that is planned and permanent. But certainly the mass character is there. If you just look back to the Rodney King situation, those Africans who rebelled en masse. They had no planning. That's how backward they were. They didn't think about it. Just on the spot, they said, "Okay, it's too much. Let's go, let's get them." And everybody said, "Okay, let's get them." And we rise up as mass and we get them. And then we sit down for 29 years. Of course. Of course. But the mass character is there, and we must understand this mass character. The 5th Pan-African Congress, most of Africa, of course, was colonized. Kwame Nkrumah came to change all this. By 1958, he threw the British out of Cape Coast and named it Ghana. And Nkrumah declared before the entire world that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it's linked with the entire continent of Africa and its unification and liberty. And Nkrumah made Ghana the base for every movement that fought against colonialism. Mugabe, who's now the head of Zimbabwe, where was he trained? In Ghana. Go and ask all of them. Nkrumah set up freedom schools, teaching how to use arms to go and fight. It was Nkrumah who built the base and pushed Pan-Africanism. He understood that Africa was divided in 1865 at the Berlin Conference, and that we cannot accept divisions imposed upon us by our enemy. Africa is one, we must unify her. This has been the task. Of course, since Nkrumah, the movement picked up. The independence of Guinea came in the same 1958, later that year, and with Sekou Touré and Kwame Nkrumah, the movement really coalesced force. The Pan-African movement, of course, was not going to be left alone. Imperialism would seek to divide it. That's their job. Sekou Touré says, if the enemy is not doing anything against you, that's because you're not doing anything. Of course. Matter of fact, when they're not doing anything against me, I get scared. What am I doing wrong? So their job was to divide, and if you will look, they divided the Pan-African movement into what was called the Casablanca bloc and the Monrovia bloc, the revolutionaries and the reactionaries, to put it in one simple word. Of course, the Casablanca group included the fighting forces in Algeria, the FLN, which the other African states refused to recognize. Of course, Nasser had to be in it. Of course, Nkrumah. Of course, Sekou Touré, Tunisia, and of course, Mohammed V in Morocco, who had just waged serious war to get independence away from the French. The other group was called the Moderate Group, and they were all made up of reactionaries and scum of our race who didn't want African unity and raise a million problems and sabotage it and work for imperialism against the interests of their people, and that still continues today. I always say one of the weaknesses of the African Revolution is that we are the only people who allow our enemies to strut with impunity amongst us. It's only because of our weakness. It's only because of our weakness. Only because of our weakness.
I always say I was a Pan-Africanist before I knew what Pan-Africanism was, because the red, black, and green flag just always naturally vibrated with me, even before joining the UNIA. And I grew up right around the corner. I grew up, I would say, the most significant childhood home where I lived, where I was from 4th grade until my junior year of college. Walking is probably 1, 2, 3, it's literally about 6 blocks away from the UNIA, but I never knew it was there. I did not learn about the UNIA being where it was until I graduated from undergrad in 1997. So ironically, my mother bought all of my sneakers for school and for play right next door to the UNIA. So my whole life, we were going right next door to the Garvey movement, and I never knew it until I came out of college.
Now, for those who might know, what is Pan-Africanism?
Pan-Africanism,
the concept of Pan-Africanism.
To sum it up in 4 principles, and Garveyism is simply the highest stage of Pan-Africanism. The first principle, all African people are one family. We believe in one race, one family, one people. So whether you in New York speaking English, whether you in South Africa speaking Zulu, whether you in Brazil speaking Portuguese, whether you in Haiti speaking French, wherever you are on this earth, if you descend from the original man and woman that the Creator put on African soil, then you are members of that original African family. And more importantly, we identify as being African family first. So that means that you're never a Christian who happens to be African. You're never a Muslim who happens to be African. You are African who happens to be a Muslim. You are African who happens to be Christian. Nothing supersedes your racial family identity. So the religion isn't first, the profession isn't first, your gang, your clique, your organization, your frat, nothing comes before the race. The race is the essential human family, and that's what we identify as first.
So Pan-Africanism would say that all black people are out of Africa. What do you say to people that say black people are the original people of the planet Earth, and we're not isolated to just coming out of Africa? What do you say to that?
Well, I don't think those two statements are mutually exclusive, in that we are the original people of the earth and we are the original people of every continent.
Here is our
but your origin
just joined us.
The origin and the beginning of mankind is the mother continent. And anyone who would dispute that, let's just go to the artifacts, because anything sounds good when it's in theory. Anything sounds good when it's in philosophy. People can say, I was already in America, I was already over here. Okay, prove it with the artifacts. There is no artifact of a man or woman, modern man or woman, that is older than any of the artifacts found on the mother continent. So when we deal with it anthropologically, historically, culturally, we can just go to the artifacts. When you go to the artifacts, the argument is dead. When you go to it genetically, the argument is dead.
Here's the thing, though. Who's giving us this information? Who's giving us these artifacts? Who's giving us this so-called DNA, this who they say was the Bones and all that, Sally
Right.
or whatever their names are, like a lot of this stuff, honestly, if you trace it back, it kind of traces itself to Darwinism, the out of Africa theory, saying that evolution, and that black people, we came from monkeys and all of this type of nonsense, and that all people came from Africa because we were basically the more undeveloped people. And see, this is a way for white people to try to act like they are an improvement upon evolution. And there's a lot of people that say that they were some of the first ones to come with this with this theory, with this out of Africa theory. What do you feel about that?
Well, the out of Africa theory is not synonymous with Darwinism or the theory of evolution. Okay, as Pan-Africanists or any African scientists, we reject the notion that we came from monkeys. We flat out reject that.
Facts.
Okay. We also reject the notion that the African is a primitive version of the European. We reject that as well.
Facts.
Our research is not coming from Europeans. Our research is coming from Africans. In fact, one of the modern fathers of Pan-Africanism, His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, his grandson is one of the leading anthropological and genetic scientists on the African continent, and he is actually responsible for discovering some of the oldest fossils of modern man on the continent. In fact, His Majesty's grandson unearthed African fossils that are older than the Denginesh fossil that was found in Ethiopia, called Lucy, by the Europeans, who was 2 million years old. His Majesty's grandson, Dr. Selassie I, found the remains of ancestors that were 8, 10, 12 million years old, much older than that of the so-called Lucy or the Denginesh. And then there were other African scientists, even more recently in West Africa and even in Central Africa, who found bones, the remains of Africans that can even challenge, the latest dated fossils that Dr. Selassie has found. So none of this science is coming from white people. This is all coming from Africans. We were first. And as I say, go to the artifacts.
Right.
Sometimes you have to deal in theory. Sometimes you have to deal in theory because you're short on evidence. We're not short on evidence when you're dealing with the origin of man.